Alexander the Great's story begins in 356 BCE. In the ancient city of Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia. At the time of his birth, Macedonia was a rising power, but it was not yet the dominant force it would later become. His father, King Philip II, had taken the throne only a few years earlier, and was already proving himself to be one of the most capable rulers and military minds in the Greek world. His mother, Olympias, was a proud and deeply spiritual woman from Epirus, and her beliefs had a lasting effect on her son. She often told him that his destiny was extraordinary, that he was no ordinary child but one chosen by the gods. Ancient writers even suggest that Olympias claimed Alexander was a descendant of Achilles, the legendary hero of Homer's Iliad, while others believed Zeus himself had played a role in his conception. Whether true or not, such stories surrounded Alexander from the moment he was born, fueling his sense of destiny. From childhood, Alexander was exposed to the world of politics and war. Unlike most children who played games or ran in the streets, Alexander spent his early years listening to soldiers' tales, watching his father prepare for campaigns, and learning how kingdoms were ruled. He was curious, observant, and eager to prove himself. It was clear even at a young age that he was not content to live in the shadow of others. His determination and ambition made him stand out from other boys of his age. One of the most famous stories from Alexander's childhood illustrates this perfectly. The taming of Bucephalus, the horse that would later carry him through countless battles. According to legend, Philip had purchased a large and powerful horse, but no one in his court could ride it. The animal was considered wild and unmanageable, throwing off anyone who tried to mount him. When the horse was about to be dismissed as useless, young Alexander stepped forward. Observing carefully, he noticed that the horse was frightened by its own shadow. Turning the animal's head toward the sun so that the shadows fell behind, Alexander was able to calm it. Then, with confidence and courage far beyond his years, he mounted Bucephalus and rode him successfully. The onlookers were astonished, and King Philip himself, watching this display of bravery and intelligence, is said to have exclaimed, "My boy, you must find a kingdom great enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." This event not only symbolized Alexander's unique ability to solve problems, but also foreshadowed the extraordinary path he was destined to follow. But Alexander's character was not shaped by courage alone. His upbringing was a careful balance of discipline, inspiration, and ambition. Olympias was fiercely protective and often reminded Alexander that greatness awaited him. She filled his mind with stories of gods, heroes, and warriors, nurturing the belief that he was meant to surpass ordinary men. Meanwhile, Philip provided him with real examples of leadership. King Philip II was not just a ruler, but also a brilliant military reformer who introduced tactics and strategies that transformed Macedonia's army into one of the most powerful forces in Greece. Alexander observed his father's successes closely, and while he admired Philip, he also grew determined to surpass him. The tension between admiration and rivalry with his father would shape much of his personality. He did not want to be known merely as the son of Philip, but as a figure of even greater renown. In Pella, Alexander's childhood was filled with training in every skill expected of a prince and future king. He practiced hunting, horseback riding, combat with spear and sword, and wrestling. These activities were not simply games, but essential preparations for leadership in a world where rulers were expected to lead armies into battle themselves. Hunting lions, for example, was considered a mark of courage, and Alexander excelled in such trials, displaying not only bravery, but also strategy and precision. His physical training was paired with lessons in self-control and endurance. As Macedonian leaders were expected to withstand hardship alongside their soldiers, even as a boy, Alexander revealed a fierce temper and an unshakable sense of self-belief. He disliked being outdone and often reacted strongly when challenged or dismissed. There are accounts that he wept when he heard of his father's victories, not out of jealousy alone, but because he feared that there would be nothing left for him to conquer once he became king. This mixture of ambition and impatience set him apart. driving him toward achievements far beyond the expectations of others. The world around him was also shaping his destiny. Greece at the time was a collection of city-states, each with its own rivalries, ambitions, and culture. Macedonia, under Philip's rule, was beginning to rise above them, uniting much of Greece through diplomacy and war. Young Alexander grew up watching this transformation, seeing firsthand how power could shift and how a clever ruler could bend others to his will. These lessons, combined with his personal drive, laid the foundation for the man he would become. By the time Alexander was a teenager, his identity was already tied to greatness. He was not just the son of Philip and Olympias, not just the boy who tamed a wild horse. He was being shaped into someone who believed his fate was larger than Macedonia, larger than Greece, and perhaps larger than the world itself. Every influence around him, his parents, his training, the stories of heroes, and the political climate of his time pushed him toward a future where conquering, ruling, and leaving a mark on history would not just be ambitions, but necessities. The education of Alexander the Great was one of the most critical foundations of his extraordinary life, for it was during his formative years that his mind was shaped, his vision was broadened, and his ambitions were fueled by both knowledge and inspiration. Unlike most boys of his age, Alexander's education was not confined to military training or the typical lessons of royal etiquette. His father, King Philip II, understood that his son was destined for more than just ruling Macedonia. He was to lead men, conquer lands, and shape civilizations. To prepare him for such a destiny, Philip sought out one of the greatest minds of the ancient world to guide his son, the philosopher Aristotle. When Alexander was around 13 years old, Aristotle was summoned to Pella, where he became the boys' tutor. This was no ordinary education. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander was exposed to a vast range of knowledge. He studied philosophy, ethics, politics, logic, and science. He learned about plants and animals, about medicine and the stars, and about the organization of states and societies. But above all, Alexander developed a love for literature and poetry. Homer's Iliad became his favorite work, and he carried a copy of it with him throughout his campaigns, keeping it under his pillow at night. He did not simply admire the poem as a piece of art, he saw in it a guide for life. To Alexander, Achilles was not just a character but a role model, a warrior whose courage and pursuit of glory he sought to emulate. Aristotle's teaching, therefore, was not abstract but deeply personal, giving Alexander heroes to admire and ideas to shape his destiny. Yet, Alexander's education was not only about books and philosophy. He was taught to think critically, to question, and to seek truth. Aristotle trained him to analyze situations, to weigh possibilities, and to make decisions not only with courage but with logic. This kind of intellectual training was rare among rulers of the time, and it gave Alexander an edge that few others possessed. It was this combination of knowledge and ambition that would later allow him to lead not just through force, but through vision. Outside the classroom, Alexander was also learning from his father and the Macedonian court. King Philip was engaged in almost constant warfare, and Alexander often observed or even participated in military discussions. He watched as Philip reorganized the Macedonian army, introduced new tactics, and outmaneuvered rivals. He learned how alliances were built through marriage and diplomacy, and how enemies could be crushed with both strategy and strength. By being exposed to these realities of power, Alexander's education became a blend of philosophy and practice. He learned how men thought, what motivated them, how they could be inspired or controlled. Even during his teenage years, Alexander demonstrated qualities that showed the impact of this dual education. He was quick to challenge ideas, confident in his own reasoning, and always eager to prove himself. On one occasion, when Persian ambassadors visited the Macedonian court, the young prince surprised them by asking not about trivial matters, but about the organization of Persia's empire, its armies, and its strength. Such questions revealed a mind already focused on far greater horizons than the borders of his own kingdom. His training also emphasized discipline. Aristotle taught him about moderation and the dangers of excess, But at the same time, Alexander was encouraged to cultivate endurance, to endure hardship as a soldier would. Hunting, riding, and physical combat were all part of his daily routine, ensuring that he would grow not only as a thinker, but also as a warrior. In Macedonia, a king was expected to lead his troops into battle, to share in their struggles, and to earn their respect through bravery. Alexander absorbed these lessons deeply, and later in life, his soldiers would follow him across deserts, mountains, and rivers precisely because he never demanded of them what he would not endure himself. The balance between Aristotle's wisdom and Philip's example gave Alexander a unique perspective on leadership. From Aristotle, he learned about justice, ethics, and the idea of the good life. From Philip, he learned about power, ambition, and the brutal realities of ruling in a violent world. Alexander's mind was thus trained to see the world in both philosophical and practical terms. He could imagine what a perfect society might look like, yet he also knew how to deal with rebellion, war, and betrayal. This duality would later define his reign as both a conqueror and a visionary who dreamed of blending cultures and uniting nations. But education did more than prepare Alexander for leadership. It nurtured his sense of destiny, surrounded by stories of Achilles, Heracles, and other heroes. He began to see himself not as an ordinary man, but as someone whose life was part of a larger, almost divine plan. He believed that he was meant to leave behind a legacy greater than any who came before him. This belief was not arrogance alone. It was carefully nurtured by the influences around him, by Olympias's insistence on his divine heritage, by Philip's example of greatness, and by Aristotle's teaching that knowledge and virtue could elevate a man to near godlike status. By the time Alexander was nearing adulthood, his education had equipped him with tools that few rulers ever possessed. He was not just a warrior or a scholar. He was both. He could ride fearlessly into battle and command troops with authority. Yet he could also discuss philosophy, science, and literature with the greatest minds of his age. This rare combination of intellect and courage made him a figure unlike any other, and it laid the foundation for his extraordinary journey from the prince of a small kingdom to the leader of one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The sudden rise of Alexander to the throne of Macedonia was not the result of careful planning, but of tragedy and political intrigue. In 336 BCE, King Philip II, who had spent years expanding Macedonia's power and uniting the Greek city-states, was assassinated during a wedding celebration in Ij. The reasons behind his murder have never been completely clear, with some historians suggesting personal motives from the assassin, while others suspect the involvement of political rivals. Whatever the cause, Philip's death left the kingdom vulnerable. Alexander, at just 20 years old, found himself thrust into a position of immense responsibility. The future of Macedonia, and perhaps all of Greece, now rested on his shoulders. Many doubted that such a young ruler could maintain the authority Philip had built. Enemies at home and abroad saw the moment as an opportunity to test the strength of Macedonia. Even within the royal court, there were whispers of rebellion. Philip had other wives, and the children from those marriages could have laid claim to the throne. The nobility, too, had their own ambitions, and not all were eager to follow the son of Philip and Olympias. Alexander, however, acted swiftly and decisively. He eliminated potential threats to his rule, securing his throne before opposition could grow strong. This ruthlessness shocked some, but it established his authority. A ruler in the ancient world could not afford hesitation. Alexander understood that better than most. With his position secure at home, Alexander faced the challenge of maintaining control over Greece. Philip had united the city-states under Macedonian leadership, but his death emboldened them to test their freedom. Thebes, Athens, and other cities began to stir, hoping to break free from Macedonian dominance. Alexander responded with remarkable speed. He marched south with his army, confronting the unrest directly. His presence alone was often enough to suppress rebellion. For his reputation as Philip's son and his own charisma inspired both respect and fear, yet in Thebes the resistance was stronger. Thebes dared to rise against Macedonia, perhaps believing that Alexander was too young and inexperienced to deal with them effectively. Alexander proved them wrong. In a swift and brutal campaign, he crushed the Theban revolt. The city was destroyed, its people sold into slavery, and its territory divided among its neighbors. This ruthless action shocked Greece, but it also sent a powerful message. Alexander was not a weak boy king, but a determined ruler who would tolerate no defiance. The destruction of Thebes became a turning point in his rise to power. Other Greek states quickly submitted, unwilling to share Thebes' fate. Athens, though hostile in spirit, avoided open resistance, knowing Alexander's wrath could reduce them to ruin. Within a short time, Greece was once again firmly under Macedonian control, and Alexander's authority was unchallenged. Having secured Greece, Alexander turned his eyes to a much greater ambition, the conquest of Persia. This was not a new idea. Philip himself had been preparing for a campaign against the Persian Empire before his assassination. Persia was the greatest power of the age, a vast empire stretching from Asia Minor to India, rich in resources and armies. For centuries, the Greeks had both feared and hated the Persians, remembering invasions like those of Xerxes and battles like Marathon and Thermopylae. Conquering Persia was not only a strategic goal, but also a mission of revenge and glory. By continuing his father's plan, Alexander could unite the Greeks behind him while also proving himself on the world stage. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with an army of around 40,000 men. It was a bold move for Persia's forces, vastly outnumbered his own, and many believed the campaign would end in disaster. Yet Alexander's confidence, skill, and leadership transformed the situation. His first major test came at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, or governors, gathered their forces to stop him at the crossing. Despite the dangers of attacking across a river, Alexander led his cavalry into battle, personally fighting at the front. His daring assault broke the Persian lines, and his victory at Granicus opened the way into Asia Minor. It was a stunning demonstration of both bravery and tactical genius. From there, Alexander moved quickly, capturing cities and securing his foothold in Asia. Each success strengthened his reputation and encouraged his men to follow him further. He showed not only military brilliance, but also political skill, treating conquered territories with a mixture of firmness and respect. He often left local leaders in place if they pledged loyalty, ensuring stability while expanding his control. The true test, however, came in 333 BCE at the Battle of Issus. Here, Alexander faced King Darius III himself, the ruler of the Persian Empire. Darius brought a massive army, far outnumbering Alexander's forces, yet Alexander's tactics once again proved superior. With a daring maneuver, he led a charge directly at Darius, throwing the Persian army into chaos. Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his family and leaving his army to collapse. This victory was not only a military triumph, but also a psychological one. The image of the Persian king running from the young Macedonian conqueror shattered Persia's aura of invincibility. By now, Alexander was no longer just the ruler of Macedonia. He was becoming a figure of legend. His rise to power had been rapid, ruthless, and unstoppable. From the boy who inherited a fragile throne at 20, had become the commander of armies that humbled the greatest empire in the world. His soldiers trusted him, his enemies feared him, and his ambition knew no limits. The rise of Alexander was not merely the story of a king securing his throne. It was the story of a man who believed he was destined for greatness and who would stop at nothing to achieve it. By the time Alexander reached his mid-20s, his victories against Persia had already made him a figure of awe across the ancient world. What began as a continuation of his father's ambition soon grew into a mission far greater: the creation of an empire that spanned continents and reshaped civilizations. After defeating Darius III at Issus and seizing control of Asia Minor, Alexander pushed further south, where he would face new challenges, new cultures, and opportunities to carve his name into history as a ruler who sought not only conquest, but also transformation. His march into Egypt was one of the most significant stages of his campaign. In 332 BCE, after a long siege at the island city of Tyre, Alexander continued along the eastern Mediterranean coast. City after city submitted to his rule, either out of fear or admiration, until he entered Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator. For centuries, Egypt had been under Persian domination, and its people saw Alexander as the one who had freed them from their oppressors. His entry into Egypt was not marked by destruction, but by celebration. He respected Egyptian traditions and participated in religious ceremonies, carefully portraying himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a rightful pharaoh chosen by the gods. It was in Egypt that Alexander laid the foundations for what would become one of the most famous cities of the ancient world, Alexandria. Strategically, along the Mediterranean coast, this city was envisioned as a hub of trade, learning, and culture. Though Alexander himself would not live to see its greatness, Alexandria later became a symbol of his vision. Home to the legendary library and a melting pot where Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern traditions blended together. By founding Alexandria, Alexander revealed that his ambitions extended beyond military victories. He sought to leave behind monuments of unity and progress. After securing Egypt, Alexander returned eastward to confront Darius once again. The decisive moment came in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela, facing an army far larger than his own. Alexander demonstrated his unmatched brilliance as a strategist. He used the terrain to his advantage, stretched the Persian lines, and launched a direct assault at Darius himself. Once again, the Persian king fled, abandoning his men. The Persian army collapsed, and with this victory, Alexander effectively brought the mighty Persian Empire to an end. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, great centers of Persian power, fell into his hands. When he entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, Alexander allowed his men to plunder the city. Later, in a moment both symbolic and controversial, he set fire to the royal palace. Some accounts suggest it was an act of revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece over a century earlier, while others argue it was a drunken impulse. Regardless of the motive, the burning of Persepolis marked the symbolic destruction of Persia's old glory and the rise of Alexander's new order. Yet, Alexander's ambitions did not end with the conquest of Persia. For him, victory was never final. It was always the beginning of the next campaign. With Persia under his control, he turned his attention eastward toward the unknown lands of Central Asia and India. These campaigns were far more challenging than his earlier victories. He faced not only fierce resistance from local rulers, but also the difficulties of unfamiliar terrain, harsh climates, and constant unrest in newly conquered territories. In regions like Bactria and Sogdiana, he fought guerrilla warfare against elusive enemies, sometimes marrying diplomacy with force. To secure loyalty, he took Roxana, a Bactrian princess, as his wife, symbolizing his policy of blending cultures rather than simply imposing Greek dominance, perhaps the most ambitious. An exhausting part of his conquests came when he led his army into India. In 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the formidable Hindu Kush mountains and advanced into the Punjab region. Here, he encountered King Porus, a powerful ruler who commanded war elephants, creatures unfamiliar to Macedonian soldiers. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced one of the fiercest challenges of his career. The battle was brutal, with heavy losses on both sides, but Alexander's tactical genius and determination carried the day. Pressed by Porus's bravery and leadership, Alexander did not depose him, but instead restored him as a ruler under his authority. This decision reflected not only respect for a worthy opponent, but also Alexander's vision of empire building through cooperation and cultural fusion. But the march deeper into India tested the limits of his men. After years of continuous campaigning, his soldiers had grown weary. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured extreme hardships. When Alexander pressed them to go further east, toward the unknown lands beyond the Ganges, his army finally refused. It was one of the rare moments when even Alexander's charisma and authority could not push his men further. Reluctantly, he agreed to turn back. Though his ambition to see what lay beyond remained unfulfilled, the return journey was no less arduous. Alexander led part of his army through the harsh Jedrazin desert, where many perished from thirst and exhaustion. Despite the suffering, his presence at the front, sharing in the hardships, inspired loyalty. Even in the most desperate conditions, Alexander's men followed him. For they saw in him not just a king, but a leader willing to endure the same trials as his soldiers. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, his empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, across Persia, and into the frontiers of India. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, encompassing a vast diversity of peoples, languages, and cultures. But for Alexander, conquest was never merely about territory. He encouraged his men to marry local women, adopted Persian customs, and envisioned a world where East and West could blend into a single, united civilization. His empire was not just a demonstration of military might, but a laboratory for cultural fusion, where Greek ideas mingled with Persian traditions, Egyptian beliefs, and Indian influences. In 323 BCE, at the height of his power, Alexander the Great's life came to an abrupt and mysterious end in the city of Babylon. He was just 32 years old, yet in a little more than a decade he had built the largest empire the world had ever known. His sudden death left his soldiers, his generals, and the entire known world in shock. Some accounts say that Alexander fell ill after a banquet, stricken with fever that worsened over days until he could no longer speak. Others whisper of poisoning, though historians have long debated whether that was truly possible given the medical knowledge and methods of the time. Uncertainty surrounding his death only adds to the aura of mystery that has always surrounded him. What is certain is that when Alexander died, he left behind an empire too vast to be held together by any one successor. The immediate aftermath of his death revealed the fragility of what he had built. Alexander had not named a clear heir. Some sources claim that, when asked on his deathbed who should succeed him, he replied, "To the strongest." Whether these words were truly spoken or later invented, they capture the essence of what followed. His generals, known as the Diadochi, divided his empire among themselves, each taking a portion to rule. This division led to decades of conflict, known as the Wars of the Successors, as former comrades turned into rivals, each seeking to carve out kingdoms from Alexander's vast domain. The empire that had stretched from Greece to India fractured into pieces. And yet, despite this disintegration, the influence of Alexander's vision continued to shape the world. One of the most enduring aspects of Alexander's legacy was the spread of Hellenistic culture. Wherever he went, he carried with him not just armies, but also ideas. Greek language, art, architecture, and philosophy blended with the traditions of Persia, Egypt, and the East, creating a new cultural synthesis that historians now call the Hellenistic Age. This blending was not superficial. It transformed cities, societies, and even ways of thinking. In newly founded cities like Alexandria in Egypt, Greek theaters stood beside Egyptian temples. Scholars from many lands studied together, and merchants brought goods and knowledge from distant regions. Greek became the common language of trade and learning, allowing ideas to flow more freely across cultures than ever before. This cultural fusion was one of Alexander's greatest achievements, one that outlived his empire and shaped the ancient world for centuries. Alexander's vision of unity extended beyond culture. His policy of encouraging marriages between his soldiers and women from the lands they conquered was a bold experiment in bringing different peoples together. At Susa, he famously arranged a mass wedding between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, symbolizing his desire to create bonds between East and West. While not all of these unions lasted, the idea behind them reflected Alexander's belief that conquest was not enough. Lasting rule required connection and integration. His own marriage to Roxana, the Bactrian princess, was another example of this policy, blending royal Macedonian blood with the lineage of Central Asia. Egypt, his legacy was immortalized in the city of Alexandria. which became one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. The famous Library of Alexandria, though established after his death, was part of the vision he inspired, a place where knowledge from every culture could be gathered, studied, and preserved. Alexandria and other cities he founded, Alexander's dream of creating hubs of culture and progress continued to flourish long after his death. Military leaders and emperors who came after Alexander looked to him as the ultimate model of greatness. Julius Caesar wept when he visited a statue of Alexander, lamenting that at the same age he had achieved so little compared to the Macedonian conqueror. Napoleon Bonaparte studied his campaigns and sought to emulate his genius on the battlefield. Generals across history have admired his use of strategy, speed, and boldness, often finding in his victories lessons that remain relevant even in modern warfare. Alexander's reputation as one of the greatest military minds of all time has never diminished. But Alexander's legacy was not without complexity. His relentless ambition pushed his men to the limits of endurance, and some saw him not only as a visionary, but also as a tyrant, driven by insatiable desire for conquest. His adoption of Persian customs caused unease among his Macedonian soldiers, who feared he was abandoning their traditions in favor of foreign ways. His temper, at times violent, led to the deaths of close companions, such as Cletus the Black, whom Alexander killed in a fit of rage. These flaws remind us that Alexander was not a god, but a man of immense talent, passion, imperfection. Yet it is precisely these complexities that make his legacy so enduring. He was not simply a conqueror who destroyed, he was also a builder, who sought to connect. He was not only a king of Macedonia, but a ruler who envisioned a world larger than any single nation. His life was brief, his empire short-lived, yet his influence echoed for centuries in the political, cultural, and intellectual developments of the Mediterranean and beyond. The blending of cultures that he encouraged laid the groundwork for a more interconnected world, where ideas, goods, and traditions crossed boundaries with greater ease. When Alexander's body was taken to Egypt, where it was eventually laid to rest in Alexandria, pilgrims from across the ancient world came to pay homage. His tomb became a symbol of his enduring presence, a place where rulers and philosophers could reflect on the meaning of greatness. Though the exact location of his final resting place has been lost to history, the fascination with finding it persists, a testament to the enduring power of his story. For generations after his death, legends about Alexander grew. He appeared not only in historical accounts, but in myths, poems, and even religious traditions across different cultures. In the East, he was remembered as a figure of justice and wisdom. In the West, as the archetype of the heroic conqueror. His image transcended borders, becoming a universal symbol of ambition, courage, and destiny. The legacy of Alexander the Great is therefore not confined to the lands he conquered, but lives on in the imagination of humanity as one of the most remarkable figures ever to walk the earth.